Today we will be considering Chapter 5.3, the House of Representatives, and we're going to look specifically at that branch of Congress or at that House of Congress. Make sure that as you watch the video that you fill in your notes. If there's anything in red on the Google slide, make sure you type that into your notes and then submit your notes for a grade when you're finished. Feel free to pause the video at any time you need to. Okay, so we're going to be considering the House of Representatives, like I said. Now let's think about what we've talked about so far in Chapter 5. The first thing we looked at was just Congress itself and how it represents the people. It has constituents, which are the people it represents. We talked about who the members of Congress are, the two different House structure. You have your House of Representatives, which is elected every 2 years from the people, and every representative is represents roughly the same number of people as the others because it's based on population. So each state has a varying number, but you cannot have fewer than one. But you also have the Senate, which is every state gets two senators, and they are elected for 6 years terms. Congress has checks and balances on other branches of government, and other branches of government have checks and balances on them. We also looked last time at the powers of Congress, the express powers, things the Constitution specifically says they can do, as well as the implied powers and the inherent powers. And we talked specifically about some of those powers that they have. So today we want to focus specifically on the House of Representatives, which is part of Congress, the legislative or lawmaking branch of government. First question we want to consider today is, what are the key features of the House of Representatives and its membership? So what is unique about it? Well, the one thing that we see about it is that they are elected by direct popular election. What that means is that ever since the beginning of our country, the Constitution has laid out that each state would have their representatives based on apportioned by population. Okay, and so that's why every representative represents roughly the same number of people as every other representative, and they are elected by the people of the district that they represent. Now, in small states like Wyoming, where they only have enough people for one representative, the whole state will vote on it. But like in Texas, we have 36 different representatives. So every representative has its own district, and the people of those districts vote to elect their representative. The second qualification from the Constitution is that they must be at least 25 years old. Very rarely are they ever that young, although currently in Congress, and was just elected for the first time here in November of 2020, is a representative from Western North Carolina. His name is Madison Cawthorn. He is 25 years old now, and he I think he's the youngest. I know he's the youngest in there now, and I think he's the youngest maybe ever, because usually they're not that young. There's also well-known Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is probably 30 now, but 31 maybe. She was 28, I think, when she first got elected to the House, and she's from New York. Okay, they must be a U.S. citizen for at least 7 years. Now, contrary to what the president requires, the president must be a natural-born American citizen. The representatives do not. You can come from another country, be a citizen of another country, but have lived here and become a citizen. And once you've been a citizen for at least 7 years of this country, you can then run for Congress and be a member of the House of Representatives. And there are some who are foreign-born, who are from other countries, who became American citizens, have lived here the requisite amount of time, and are now representatives in the House of Representatives. That's just part of that American dream. They must also be a resident of the state that they represent. Now, there is nothing in the Constitution that says they have to live in the district they represent, although they generally do. But it's not a constitutional requirement. I think there was a state that tried to put that that requirement into their state law, but the Supreme Court overruled that and said it was not in keeping with the Constitution. So they don't have to live in the district they represent, but it's probably a good idea that they do, and most of them do. They must have an ability to raise money. That's not a formal qualification, but that is an informal qualification, because running for Congress is not a cheap endeavor. And so if a person is going to be successful in their campaign, they must make sure that they are able to raise the money that they need to raise. It can cost up to $1 million, maybe more, to run for Congress. And it just depends on what kind of opposition you have and things like that. So you have to be able to fundraise and convince people to support your candidacy. Second question, what are some of the challenges that reapportionment and redistricting raise? Now let's talk about this for a moment. I've used that word apportionment before and reapportionment, so I want to review what we've talked about on that term. Apportionment. When the Constitution was written, they said that the representatives shall be apportioned based on the population. So that means that however many representatives there are in total, that is then divided up among the 50 states to determine how many, based on population, to determine how many each state gets. So right now, in law, they passed a law in 1929 that set the number of representatives at 435. So there are 435 total representatives. Well, in 2020, they did a census, and they're going to find out the new population of the country and each state. And so what they'll do is they'll figure out the percentages, the ratios. I don't know exactly how it all works, but they will do that. And once they have that, then they will determine how many representatives each state is going to get. That is called reapportionment. So like Texas, because our population has gained significantly over the last few years, will probably have more representatives after this process is complete. California, I don't know. They've gained some, but they've lost some, so they may gain or lose. New York will probably lose. They've lost quite a few people over the last few years. Florida will probably gain quite a few, actually. Redistricting is when they readjust the districts to account for the population changes. So if an area has grown a lot, then they'll have to change the boundaries so that those people, the districts will have roughly the same number of people in each district. So out of the 36 Texas districts, and it's not perfect because people move, but they roughly represent around 700,000 people per district. So what are some of the challenges that reapportionment and redistricting raise? Well, a state can lose a seat when the population declines. Like I said, New York is probably going to lose some people. Illinois is another state that has lost some population as well. So they're probably going to lose House seats as their population has declined. Gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is when they will draw those new districts to be politically beneficial to somebody. Okay, so they're purposely drawing those boundaries for the districts to either help like a particular party win, like a Democrat win or a Republican win, or to make sure that a minority wins. Or in the past, they've gerrymandered districts to make sure that minorities wouldn't have much of a chance to win in some districts. So gerrymandering, and every state does it depending on who's in power. But gerrymandering is a problem, and if you're a person that's not in the majority, gerrymandering would be a problem for you in your particular state. Disenfranchisement of racial or ethnic minorities. That would mean that they are redistricted out of being able to be represented in Congress. Now, there are laws in place that hopefully will prevent that have been in place since the 1960s. And so that is not as likely to happen as it used to be. Okay, third question is, how is the leadership of the House organized? Well, you have the Speaker of the House. This person is elected from among the members of the House of Representatives, and usually the majority party, whichever party has the most seats, will choose that person. Now, everybody votes on it, but the majority party, of course, they're all going to vote for the same person, and so they're going to get to select that person. So right now, the Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi. And because she is the leader of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives, so now that they have the majority, she was elected by the Democrats to be their leader, and as a result is the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker of the House is very powerful. The Speaker of the House determines the calendar of the House, what legislation is going to be debated and when. They determine what bills are going to go to what committees. They have a lot of power. The Speaker is very, very powerful. It's also second in line to the President behind the Vice President. You have your floor leaders. So that will be your majority leader and your minority leader. So for instance, in the Democratic Party right now in the House, you have Nancy Pelosi, who is the Speaker of the House. Well, her majority leader, the next highest ranking Democrat, I believe is Steny Hoyer from Maryland. And he is kind of like leading the debate, leading the stuff on the floor while she kind of runs the House. He runs the process for the Democrats. Then you have the minority leader, which right now would be the Republicans, and it's Kevin McCarthy, and he runs things for the Republicans. Then you have your whips. Your whips are the next highest ranking people in each party, and their job is to make sure they know how members in their party feel about certain issues and kind of to have a tally of who's going to vote which way on which bills, and to try to keep their members in line. So if you're a Republican whip, you want to try to keep all the Republican members of Congress voting for what your leaders say they should vote for, just kind of keep the party together. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's their job. That's their goal. Okay. Then you have the chair of the Rules Committee. You had several committees, but one of them is the Rules Committee. And the Rules Committee is very, very important because the Rules Committee, and we'll talk more about this later, but the Rules Committee sets the rules for how long the debate's going to be on each bill, whether they can offer amendments or not, and all of those things. And so the chair of the Rules Committee holds a lot of power and usually works in conjunction with the Speaker of the House to determine what bills are going to be discussed and how long they're going to be debated and all those things. The sub-question to that one is, what is the House Rules Committee? Now, the Senate does not have a Rules Committee. Only the House of Representatives does. It sets the rules for when, how, and under what conditions debate on a bill will take place. And our last question for these notes is, what is the role of the committees in the operation of the House? So what they do is they divide the work of analyzing proposed legislation based on a member's specific areas of policy expertise. And they have several different committees that are in the House. And they have standing committees, which are always there. Then they have select committees, which are only appointed for temporary purposes and then are dissolved. But for instance, you have the House Ways and Means Committee, which is one of the more important committees in the House. And what they do is they determine the budget and the taxes that are going to be proposed. And so any bill that would do with budget would be sent to the House Ways and Means Committee. If there's a bill that is dealing with the Defense Department, then that bill would be sent to the Defense Committee. And whatever the committee is, we'll get those bills that are done to that. And so what they do is those members that are on those committees usually request to be on there, and they usually have some kind of expertise in that subject area. And they help craft the legislation or form the bills to, the bills are proposed and put to them, but then they help analyze them, have hearings on them, and change them as needed before they're sent back to the full House for a vote. There are 20 permanent or standing committees, like the House Ways and Means Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, the House Defense Committee. Then you have select committees that are there to carry out specific tasks that are not covered by existing committees. So if there's a special issue that comes up that already doesn't have a committee related to it, they'll form a committee called the Select Committee that deals only with that subject. And they don't necessarily deal with legislation so much as they advise the House on what they need to do and how to handle certain situations. Then you have joint committees, which are committees made up of both members of the House and the Senate. So the joint committees are when there needs to be something, and they don't really have any legislative power at all. But what they'll do is they will, when there's an issue that concerns both the House and the Senate, they'll form a joint committee to try to work out a solution to it. So for instance, there was a few years ago a joint committee on immigration. So you had members of the House, members of the Senate that were selected, and they worked on this joint committee, and they proposed some immigration changes. Now, nothing they proposed actually got done, but that was the purpose of it. Okay, so a joint committee is a temporary committee that's made up of both members of the House and the Senate and deals with issues that are important to both. Okay, and then we realize that committee chairs have a lot of power. The committee chairs are so important because they're in charge of the committee. And it's the way it's determined is they have an election in the committee, and it's usually the person who's been in the House longest in the majority party on that committee is the chair of that committee. Now, not always. There are term limits, so that sometimes has to change. But they set the schedule for the committee. In other words, they decide what they're going to consider, when they're going to consider it, how much debate they're going to allow. They decide whether they're going to be hearings or not. They decide whether they're going to have people come and testify or not. So they have a whole lot of power over what legislation gets considered or doesn't get considered and how it gets considered, whether it's amended or not. They have a lot of say. And so being a committee chair in the House of Representatives is a very powerful position. All right, and that is going to be all for this lesson. Please make sure you submit these notes for a grade and complete any assignment that's in Google Classroom for you to do. Let me know if you have any questions.